Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we wander the forgotten halls of Middle-earth and unearth the stories Tolkien left in shadow. Before we begin, take a moment to share in the comments where you are listening from, and whether this tale has found you in the quiet of dawn or the deep hours of night. Tonight, we follow one such path, the downfall of the White Wizard, and the moment Saruman turned his back on the council he once led, in the depths of Orthanc. Where black stone pierces the sky like a dagger thrust toward the heavens, a figure stands silhouetted against the dying light of day. His robes, once pure as winter snow, now shimmer with colors that shift and dance. White bleeding into silver, silver into gold, gold into something darker still. The palantir glows before him, its surface swirling with visions of fire and shadow, and in its depths, a great eye burns with malice. The white hand of Saruman tightens around his staff, knuckles pale as bone, and in that moment, we witness not the rise of evil, but its most tragic fall. How did the wisest of the Istari, the head of the White Council, the guardian sent to protect Middle-earth from darkness, become the very shadow he was meant to dispel? This is not merely a tale of corruption. It is the story of how knowledge without humility becomes a poison more deadly than any orc blade. How the brightest star can burn so fiercely that it consumes itself, leaving only darkness in its wake. Saruman's betrayal was not born in a single moment of weakness. It did not spring fully formed from one conversation with the Dark Lord, nor from one glimpse into the seeing stone that would ultimately enslave him. No, his fall was a gradual descent, a slow erosion of purpose that took centuries to complete. Like water wearing away stone, drop by patient drop, the corruption worked its way to the deepest foundations of his being, until the edifice of his wisdom collapsed inward, leaving only the shell of greatness wrapped around a core of ambition and fear. To understand this tragedy, and it is a tragedy in the truest sense, for Saruman was meant for glory and instead found ruin, we must journey back to the beginning. Back to the days when the White Council was young and hope still burned bright in the hearts of the wise. Back to the moment when a Maya clothed in the form of an old man first set foot upon the shores of Middle-earth. Bearing the weight of a mission he did not yet know he would betray. The air in Orthanc grows colder as night deepens. The wizard standing before the palantir does not move, does not blink, does not seem to breathe. He is lost in communion with something vast and terrible, something that whispers promises of power and speaks the language of inevitability. Once, he would have recognized these whispers for what they are: the voice of the enemy, the corruption of Sauron working to bend all wills to his service. Once, he would have turned away, would have broken the connection, would have fled to his allies and confessed the danger he had discovered. But that was before knowledge became obsession, before wisdom transformed into pride, before the guardian became the betrayer. In the darkness of the tower, surrounded by the accumulated lore of ages, by books stolen from Gondor and scrolls copied from elven libraries, by artifacts gathered from the ruins of Nentamena and devices crafted in his own forges, Saruman the White makes his choice. Or perhaps, after so many years of small compromises and incremental surrenders, there is no choice left to make. Perhaps the decision was made long ago, in moments so subtle that even he did not recognize them, as the turnings of his fate. The palantir pulses. The eye within it grows larger, more insistent. And Saruman, who once commanded the respect of Elrond and Galadriel, who once stood as the chief hope of the free peoples against the returning shadow, bows his head in submission to a will greater and darker than his own. But this moment, this terrible, final moment of surrender, is merely the culmination of a process that began centuries before. To comprehend the full weight of this tragedy, we must trace the path that led to it. We must walk alongside Saruman through the long years of his decline, marking each turning where he might have chosen differently. Each crossroad where the path of light was offered and rejected in favor of the road that led to darkness. For Saruman's fall illuminates something fundamental about the nature of corruption in Tolkien's vision of the world. Evil does not announce itself with trumpets and banners. It does not stride boldly into the halls of the wise and declare its intentions. Instead, it creeps in through the cracks of our certainties, disguised as wisdom, wearing the mask of necessity, speaking in the voice of pragmatism and good sense. The greatest evils are committed not by those who desire evil for its own sake, but by those who convince themselves that terrible means are justified by noble ends, that the rules that govern lesser beings need not apply to the truly wise, that corruption is something that happens to others, to the weak, to the foolish, to those who lack the strength and knowledge necessary to wield power without being consumed by it. Saruman believed, until the very end, that he was the exception, that his wisdom made him immune to the very corruption he had spent centuries studying, that his understanding of the enemy's methods gave him the ability to employ those same methods without succumbing to the darkness they represented. In this belief, this fundamental miscalculation of his own nature, lay the seed of his destruction. The Tower of Orthanc stands now in darkness, its master deep in communion with forces he believes he controls, but which have, in truth, already claimed him. Outside, the realm of Isengard transforms, day by day, from a green valley into a wasteland of forges and pits, of smoke and ash and the clangor of war, machines being born in fire. The Ents, ancient guardians of the forest, watch in growing horror as trees are felled and their bodies fed to the furnaces that burn day and night beneath the ring of Isengard. But Saruman does not see the devastation he is causing, or if he sees it, he tells himself it is necessary, a price that must be paid for the greater good of victory against Sauron. He does not yet understand, or perhaps he refuses to understand, that he no longer seeks victory over the Dark Lord. That somewhere in the long years of his decline, his purpose shifted from opposition to imitation, from resistance to emulation. The White Wizard has become the very thing he was sent to destroy. And the tragedy, the bitter, aching tragedy that echoes through all of Middle-earth, is that he is the last to realize it. How did it come to this? What sequence of events, what choices and chances, led the wisest of the wise to this moment of absolute surrender? These are the questions we must answer, if we are to understand not just Saruman's fall, but the nature of all falls, the pattern of all corruption, the eternal struggle between wisdom and pride that plays out in every age and in every heart that dares to call itself great. The answers lie buried in the long history of the White Council, in the relationships between the Istari, in the subtle dynamics of pride and jealousy that poisoned what should have been an unbreakable fellowship. They lie in the lure of the Palantirai and the seductive promise of knowledge without limit. They lie in the fundamental question that haunts all who wield power. Can one study evil without being corrupted by it? Can one understand darkness while remaining in the light? Saruman believed he knew the answers to these questions. He was wrong, and his error would cost Middle-earth dearly. Let us trace, then, the long road of his descent, from the heights of wisdom to the depths of betrayal, from the brightest of the Istari to the darkest of traitors. For in understanding how Saruman fell, we may learn how to guard against such falls in our own hearts. The White Council was born from necessity, forged in the fires of growing darkness when the shadow of Dol Guldur first stretched across Greenwood the Great, transforming that ancient forest into what would come to be called Mirkwood. In the year 2463 of the Third Age, when evil stirred once more in Middle-earth and the wise grew troubled by portents and signs that none could fully interpret, Galadriel herself, Lady of Lothlorien, bearer of Nenya, oldest and mightiest of the elder remaining in the mortal lands, called for unity among the guardians of the free peoples. It was no small thing for Galadriel to issue such a summons. She who had refused the pardon of the Valar, who had chosen to remain in Middle-earth through the long ages while her kindred sailed west, who had looked upon the light of the two trees in Valinor before the world was marred. When she spoke, the wise listened with reverence and attention. Elrond of Rivendell answered her call immediately. Jill, Galad's herald, who had stood beside the High King at the Dark Lord's defeat at the end of the Second Age, who had witnessed the cutting of the ring from Sauron's hand and the terrible price paid for that victory, understood better than most the necessity of watchfulness. His house in Imladris had become a refuge of knowledge and memory, and he brought to the council not merely his own considerable wisdom, but the accumulated lore of ages preserved in the libraries of Rivendell. Radan, the shipwright, came from the Grey Havens, his ancient eyes heavy with the weight of uncounted years. Eldest of all who dwelt in Middle-earth, he had seen the rising of the sun and moon, had witnessed the return of the Noldor from Valinor, had survived the War of Wrath and the drowning of Beleriand. His counsel carried the authority of experience, so vast that even the proud Noldor deferred to his judgment in matters of moment. And from the far reaches of the world came the Istari, the wizards sent by the Valar themselves in the year 1000 of the Third Age to guide and counsel the free peoples. Never to rule, never to match power with power. They had arrived aboard ships from the west, clothed in the bodies of old men, their true nature hidden from all but the most perceptive of the elder. 5 there were in total, though only 3 concerned themselves greatly with the counsels of the wise: Saruman the White, Gandalf the Grey, and Radagast the Brown. At their head stood Saruman, called Karuna in the ancient tongue. Karuna the Skilled, master of devices and student of the enemy's ways. His knowledge was deemed beyond compare, his wisdom sufficient to lead the council through whatever trials might come. When he spoke in the assemblies of the wise, his voice carried such authority that even Galadriel, who had looked upon the face of the Valar and was herself counted among the mightiest of Middle-earth's defenders, would listen with close attention. The choice of Saruman as the council's head seemed natural, even inevitable. Among all the guardians of the free peoples, none understood the ways of power as did he. His studies into the craft of Sauron, into the making of the rings, and the methods by which the Dark Lord had nearly brought Middle-earth under his dominion, were exhaustive and profound. Where others spoke in generalities about the nature of evil, Saruman could discourse with precision on the exact mechanisms by which corruption operated, the specific techniques by which one will could be bent to serve another. This knowledge made him invaluable. In the early days of the White Council, when its members gathered to discuss the growing shadow in Mirkwood and debate what actions might be taken against it, Saruman's insights consistently proved the most penetrating, his strategies the most sophisticated. He could anticipate the enemy's moves with uncanny accuracy, could predict the consequences of various courses of action with a clarity that bordered on prophecy. Yet even in those early days, when the White Council stood united against the growing darkness and Saruman's leadership seemed a blessing beyond price, there were fractures, hairline cracks in what appeared to be an unbreakable foundation. For though Galadriel had called the council together, and though the other members had agreed that Saruman should lead it, her heart had always turned toward another of the Istari, Gandalf the Grey, called Mithrandir by the elves and Olren in the Undying Lands before he took physical form, carried himself with a humility that made princes bow and a wisdom that needed no proclamation. Where Saruman commanded respect through displays of his mastery, Gandalf earned love through his compassion and understanding. Galadriel saw in the Grey Wizard something that Saruman, for all his knowledge, lacked: a fundamental goodness of spirit, a genuine care for the small and the weak, a willingness to spend himself in service without thought of recognition or reward. When the council was formed, she had suggested, quietly, in the ancient tongue of the elves, during a private conversation she believed was unobserved, that perhaps Gandalf should have been chosen to lead instead of Saruman. But Saruman's ears were keen, and his pride was keener still. He heard those words, and though his face betrayed nothing, though he continued to act with perfect courtesy toward both Galadriel and Gandalf, something shifted in the deep places of his heart. The seed of rivalry had been planted, and in the fertile soil of Amaya's wounded pride, it would grow into something terrible indeed. The early work of the White Council focused primarily on the shadow in Dol Guldur. That ancient fortress, built long ago in the south of Greenwood, had been abandoned and ruinous for ages. But in the year 1050 of the Third Age, something had taken up residence there, a presence of malice and power that grew stronger with each passing decade. The forest around it began to sicken, its trees growing twisted and dark, its paths becoming treacherous even to the wood, elves who had dwelt there since the Elder Days. Initially, the wise believed this necromancer, as he came to be called, was perhaps one of the Nazgul or some other lesser servant of the ancient enemy. Troubling, certainly, but not a threat on the level of Sauron himself. The council's strategy during these early centuries was one of watchfulness and containment, monitoring the shadow's growth, strengthening the defenses of the surrounding realms, ensuring that whatever evil dwelt in Dol Guldur could not spread unchecked across Middle earth. Saruman argued consistently for this approach of patience and study. He cautioned against premature action, insisting that they needed to understand the nature of the threat before moving against it. His counsel seemed wise, even conservative, the careful strategy of a leader who understood that hasty action could lead to disaster. But beneath this reasonable facade, something else was at work. For even in those early years, Saruman had begun to suspect the true identity of the necromancer. His studies had led him to conclusions that he chose not to share with the council. Knowledge that he kept locked away in the vaults of his mind and the hidden archives of Orthanc. And with that secret knowledge came the first stirrings of a terrible temptation. If the necromancer was indeed Sauron, if the Dark Lord had returned to physical form and was slowly rebuilding his power in Mirkwood, then perhaps there was an opportunity here. Not merely to study the enemy from a safe distance, but to understand his methods intimately, to learn the secrets of his craft by watching him work. And if such understanding required allowing the shadow to grow a little stronger, if it meant delaying action until crucial intelligence had been gathered, well, surely that was a price worth paying for the ultimate victory that superior knowledge would make possible. The council met intermittently over the following centuries, sometimes with decades passing between assemblies. The free peoples were scattered and preoccupied with their own concerns. Gondor with the threats along its borders, the elves with the slow fading of their power, the scattered Ditunedain of the north with mere survival in the face of wilderness and watchful enemies. The shadow in Dol Guldur grew, but slowly, without the dramatic escalation that might have forced immediate action. And Saruman, from his tower in Orthanc, watched and studied and accumulated knowledge. He told himself he was gathering the intelligence necessary to eventually destroy the enemy. He assured his fellow council members that patience would be rewarded with understanding, and understanding would lead to victory. But in truth, something else was happening. In the pursuit of knowledge about evil, in the deep study of corruption and domination, Saruman was exposing himself to forces that he believed himself wise enough to resist. He was staring into an abyss, confident that his wisdom would protect him from the darkness that stared back. He was wrong. The cracks in the council's foundation were widening, though none yet realized how deep they ran. The seeds of betrayal had been planted. In Saruman's wounded pride, in his growing obsession with the enemy's methods, in the subtle distance that was developing between him and his fellow council members. The fall had begun, though the full descent lay still centuries in the future. The brightest of the Istari was learning to walk in shadow, telling himself all the while that he did so in service of the light. And the darkness, ever patient, watched and waited for its opportunity. To understand the fall, we must first witness the height from which Saruman descended, and what a height it was. In the Undying Lands, before time wore grooves in the world, before the sun and moon were set in the sky, he was called Curunir the Skilled, greatest of the order of Ald the Smith. His knowledge of devices and mechanisms, of the secret fires that shaped metal and stone, of the deep principles by which matter could be wrought into forms both beautiful and functional, was surpassed by none save perhaps Ald himself. Among the Maiar, those spirits of lesser power than the Valar, but still mightier than any creature born into the mortal world. Curungia stood as an exemplar of skill and mastery. Where others of his order contented themselves with understanding one or two aspects of creation, he ranged across the full spectrum of craft and knowledge, from the forging of metals to the cultivation of growing things, from the languages of beasts to the movements of stars. His mind was a treasury of wisdom, and he dispensed that wisdom generously to all who sought his counsel. When the shadow of Sauron began to lengthen across Middle-earth once more, when it became clear that the Dark Lord was gathering his strength for another attempt at dominion, the Valar held council on what might be done. Direct intervention was forbidden. The catastrophic destruction of Beleriand in the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age had demonstrated the terrible cost of unleashing the full power of the Valar against evil that had entrenched itself in Middle-earth. The very act of defeating Morgoth had reshaped the world, drowning entire regions beneath the sea and permanently altering the geography of the mortal lands. No, if Sauron was to be opposed, it would have to be through subtler means. The free peoples would have to find the strength to resist him within themselves, with guidance and counsel from the Valar, but not with their direct power. And so the decision was made to send emissaries, Maiar who would take physical form and dwell among the peoples of Middle-earth as counselors and guardians. It was Curuna who stepped forward first when volunteers were called for. His voice rang with certainty and purpose in the halls of Valinor, declaring his readiness to sacrifice the blessed peace of the Undying Lands for the sake of Middle-earth's preservation. Others of the Maiar were moved by his example. Olrin, despite his reservations and his professed unworthiness, agreed to go. Iwendil, lover of beasts and birds, offered his service. Two others whose names have not been preserved in the histories of the West made the journey. These 5, whom men would call the Istari and elves would know as the wizards, were given bodies appropriate to their mission, the forms of old men, that they might command respect through the appearance of age and wisdom, yet also remain approachable and humble in their demeanor. They were strictly forbidden from matching power with power, from using their full Maiar abilities to dominate or control. Their purpose was to inspire and guide, never to rule. Yet even in the manner of his volunteering, we can see the first seeds of Saruman's eventual corruption. For where Olrin hesitated and questioned his own worthiness, Curuna stepped forward with confidence and certainty. Where Iwendil went out of simple love for the living things of Middle-earth, Curunir went with a mission and a purpose. There was nothing wrong with this. Nothing inherently corrupting in confidence or in having a clear sense of purpose. But it established a pattern that would prove dangerous in time. Saruman arrived in Middle-earth approximately 1,000 years into the Third Age, during a period when the kingdoms of men were still strong and the shadow of Sauron seemed safely contained. The elves who first beheld him spoke in wonder of his presence. How the very air seemed to shimmer around him with barely contained power. How his words carried a weight that went beyond mere meaning into something approaching compulsion. Kings sought his counsel. Smiths begged to learn his secrets, and scholars would journey across continents, merely to hear him speak of ancient lore. He traveled widely in those early years, ranging across the full breadth of Middle-earth, from the grey heavens to the realms of Ron, from the frozen wastes of the north to the deserts of Harad. Everywhere he went, he gathered knowledge, learning the languages of different peoples, studying their customs and crafts, examining the ruins of earlier ages and piecing together the histories they embodied. He sought out libraries and scriptoriums, copying manuscripts and committing vast quantities of lore to his prodigious memory. At Orthanc, the tower in the ring of Isengard that the stewards of Gondor granted him as a dwelling place, Saruman established what became the greatest repository of knowledge in Middle-earth outside of Rivendell and Lothlorien. Books and scrolls lined every wall, artifacts from forgotten ages filled display cases and storage rooms. Maps and charts covered tables in chambers dedicated to specific areas of study. The tower became a destination for scholars and seekers of wisdom, who would brave the long journey to Isengard in hopes of consulting Saruman's collection, or, better yet, the master of the collection himself. But perhaps his greatest area of expertise, the subject to which he devoted the most intense study, and in which his knowledge surpassed all others in Middle-earth, was the craft and history of the Rings of Power. Saruman became the foremost authority on the techniques by which Sauron and the elven smiths of a region had wrought those terrible and beautiful artifacts, on the spells and songs woven into gold and mithril, on the exact metaphysical principles that allowed mere physical objects to command the wills of kings and kingdoms. This knowledge made him invaluable to the White Council. When questions arose about the nature of Sauron's power, or the means by which he might be resisted, Saruman could speak with an authority born of exhaustive research and deep understanding. He knew not merely that the rings were dangerous, but precisely how they were dangerous, what aspects of their victims, wills they corrupted, what levers they used to pry open the doors of resistance, what promises they whispered to those who wore them. Yet knowledge, as any student of history understands, is not the same as wisdom. Information is not identical to understanding, and the accumulation of facts about evil does not necessarily provide immunity against its corruption. Sometimes, it provides exactly the opposite. For as Saruman's expertise in the craft of the rings deepened, as he traced out every detail of their making and every nuance of their operation, something subtle shifted in his relationship to his subject. Where once he had studied the rings as a physician might study a disease, with the detached interest of one seeking to cure it, he began to study them as an artisan studies a masterwork of craft. The aesthetic dimension of the rings, the sheer brilliance of their construction, the elegance of the spells woven into their substance, began to fascinate him in ways that went beyond mere academic interest. Sauron, for all his evil, had been Alder's student before his corruption by Morgoth. He had learned the craft of shaping matter from the same Vala who had taught Karuna. The Rings of Power represented the pinnacle of that craft, the highest achievement of Ald's teaching applied with malicious purpose but breathtaking skill. And Saruman, studying them across centuries, could not help but feel a kind of kinship with their maker. Not in purpose, he told himself, but in method, in the pure exercise of craft divorced from moral consideration. This was the first great danger. the initial turning where the path of wisdom diverged from the path that Saruman chose to walk. For he began to believe that understanding the technical brilliance of the rings did not require him to feel revulsion at their purpose, that he could appreciate their construction while condemning their use, that his own strength of will was sufficient to prevent his admiration for the craft from becoming admiration for the crafter. But appreciation has a way of breeding sympathy, and sympathy of breeding justification. As Saruman's knowledge deepened, he found himself imagining what it must have been like to be Sauron in the forges of a region, working beside Celebrimbor and the other elven smiths, watching the rings take shape beneath skilled hands. The excitement of creation, the joy of bringing into being something that had never existed before, the satisfaction of solving technical problems that had stumped lesser craftsmen. These were feelings Saruman understood intimately, for he had experienced them himself in his own work. And slowly, incrementally, a thought began to take root. What if Sauron's fundamental error had not been in the making of the rings themselves, but in his evil intentions for their use? What if the craft itself was neutral, and the corruption lay not in the objects, but in the purposes to which they were put? If that were true, then perhaps someone with purer intentions could wield such power without being corrupted by it. Perhaps someone wise enough, strong enough, skilled enough could succeed where Sauron had failed, could use the methods of power for truly good ends. It was a seductive thought, made more dangerous by containing a kernel of truth. For power itself is indeed neutral. A hammer can build or destroy. Fire can warm or consume. But some forms of power, some methods of achieving dominion, corrupt by their very nature. The craft of the rings was not neutral because it was predicated on domination, on the bending of one will to serve another. You could not separate the technique from the purpose, because the technique was the purpose made manifest. But Saruman, brilliant Saruman, wise Saruman, began to believe he could make that separation. Began to believe that his wisdom made him immune to the corruption that had claimed Sauron. Began to believe that the rules that applied to others need not constrain him. Pride, ancient and subtle, had sunk its roots deep into the bedrock of his soul. The fall was inevitable now. Though centuries might pass before it became visible to outside eyes. The greatest of the Istari had taken the first steps down a path that led to darkness, telling himself all the while that his wisdom would light the way. He was walking toward an abyss with his eyes fixed on stars, unable to see the edge approaching with each confident stride. If Saruman's growing pride was the disease that ultimately destroyed him, then his rivalry with Gandalf was the symptom that first made that disease visible to observant eyes. For even as Saruman's reputation grew and his authority within the White Council seemed unassailable, a poison worked its way deeper into his heart, and that poison bore the face of the Grey Wizard. Gandalf the Grey, called Mithrandir by the elves and Stormcrow by men who feared his warnings, carried himself with an infuriating humility that somehow commanded more genuine respect than all of Saruman's carefully crafted authority. Where Saruman built his reputation through displays of knowledge and power, through demonstrations of mastery that left witnesses in awe, Gandalf seemed content to wander the roads of Middle Earth with hobbits and rangers, concerning himself with what Saruman began to see as trivial matters. The celebration of birthdays, the brewing of pipeweed, the quiet joys and small sorrows of simple folk. Yet, when the Grey Wizard spoke in council, when he raised concerns about the growing darkness, or proposed courses of action, the other members listened with an attention that sometimes seemed to surpass even what they gave to their appointed leader. There was something in Gandalf's voice, in the way he framed his arguments, that spoke to the heart rather than merely to the mind. He did not command agreement through the weight of accumulated evidence or the force of superior logic. Rather, he invited understanding, sharing his concerns in a way that made his listeners feel that they had arrived at conclusions independently, rather than having them imposed from above. Saruman watched this dynamic with growing frustration. He was the leader of the White Council, chosen for his superior wisdom and knowledge. Yet increasingly, he found himself in the position of arguing against Gandalf's proposals, of attempting to explain why the Grey Wizard's seemingly simple solutions were actually naive or insufficient. Why the situation required more sophisticated approaches that the others might not fully comprehend. The resentment grew slowly, fed by 1,000 small slights and oversights. When Galadriel had suggested, in the earliest days of the Council's formation, that perhaps Gandalf should have been chosen to lead instead of Saruman, she had spoken quietly, in the ancient tongue of the elves, during a conversation she believed was private. But Saruman's hearing was keen and his pride was keener still. Those words, half heard, possibly misinterpreted, yet seared into his memory, became a wound that never quite healed, that ached whenever Gandalf's star seemed to rise. When Elrond praised Gandalf's insight into the nature of the enemy, when Círdan spoke of the Grey Wizard with the affection one reserves for an old and deeply trusted friend, Saruman felt each word like a blade turned in his heart. Had he not spent centuries in study while Gandalf wandered the countryside? Had he not mastered lore that the Grey Wizard seemed not to even pursue? Why then did the others so often defer to Gandalf's judgment, treating his opinions with a reverence that Saruman had to constantly work to maintain? The truth, had Saruman been able to perceive it clearly, was that Gandalf possessed something that all of Saruman's knowledge could not replicate: a genuine love for the peoples of Middle-earth. Where Saruman saw the free peoples as pieces on a game board, important certainly, but primarily as factors in the great equation of resistance against Sauron, Gandalf saw them as individuals worth cherishing for their own sake. The hobbits whose company he kept, the rangers he befriended, the simple folk whose festivals he attended. These were not merely allies in a cosmic struggle, but beings whose happiness and flourishing mattered intrinsically. This love made Gandalf trustworthy in a way that mere competence could never achieve. People could sense, even if they could not articulate, that the Grey Wizard cared about them not for what they could contribute to some greater strategy, but for themselves. And so they opened their hearts to him, shared information they might have withheld from others, followed his counsel even when it led into danger. Saruman, perceiving the effects but not understanding their cause, could only interpret Gandalf's influence as evidence of some deeper game being played. What did Gandalf do during his long absences from the council? Where did he go when he disappeared for months or years at a time? The Grey Wizard spoke vaguely of his journeys, of watching and waiting, of concerns that he could not yet name or that he chose not to share. But Saruman began to wonder whether these mysterious travels served purposes that Gandalf deliberately concealed. Was the Grey Wizard playing a deeper game? Was he perhaps more ambitious than his humble manner suggested? Was his friendship with the small and the weak actually a cunning strategy to build a network of informants and allies loyal to him, personally rather than to the council as a whole? The seeds of paranoia, once planted in the fertile ground of wounded pride, grew swift and strong. And perhaps most disturbing of all, Saruman began to notice that the other members of the council seemed to trust Gandalf with secrets they did not share with their appointed leader. Whispered conversations would cease abruptly when Saruman approached. Glances would be exchanged when certain subjects arose. More than once, he caught fragments of discussion that suggested plans and preparations of which he had not been informed, decisions that had apparently been made without his consultation. The White Wizard, master of voices and lord of Orthanc, keeper of ancient lore and head of the White Council, began to feel like an outsider in the very organization he had been chosen to command. The respect he received felt increasingly performative, a courtesy extended to his position, rather than a genuine deference to his wisdom. Meanwhile, Gandalf, who held no formal office, who claimed no special authority, who seemed content to serve rather than lead, appeared to be the one whose word carried the true weight. This perception, whether accurate or distorted by Saruman's growing paranoia, became corrosive. It transformed his interactions with the council from collaborative discussions into competitions for influence. When Gandalf proposed a course of action, Saruman found himself opposing it almost reflexively, searching for flaws and complications, insisting on delays for further study. When the Grey Wizard shared information or raised concerns, Saruman would question his sources and his interpretations, suggesting that perhaps the matter was not as urgent as Gandalf claimed, or that his understanding was incomplete. The other council members, witnessing these exchanges, grew troubled. They could sense the tension between the two Istari, could feel the discord that was developing at the heart of their fellowship. But they interpreted it as a difference of strategic philosophy, rather than what it truly was: the manifestation of Saruman's wounded pride and growing jealousy. There was one member of the council whose understanding went deeper. Galadriel, ancient and wise beyond the reckoning of mortal years, whose power of perception allowed her to see into the hearts of those around her, began to sense the darkness growing in Saruman. She said nothing openly. Such an accusation against the head of the council would have fractured the fellowship beyond repair. But she watched with increasing concern as the White Wizard's demeanor shifted subtly over the decades. The changes were small at first. A sharpness in his tone when Gandalf spoke, a tendency to dismiss concerns rather than engage with them seriously, a growing inclination to keep his own counsel, to make decisions without consultation, to present his conclusions as fait accompli, rather than as proposals for discussion. His reports on his research, once detailed and shared openly, became more guarded. He spoke in generalities where once he had offered specifics, cited authorities without providing references, claimed knowledge without showing its foundations. And his attitude toward the necromancer of Dol Guldur, which had always been cautious and conservative, began to seem less like wisdom and more like obstruction. When Gandalf argued with increasing urgency that the shadow in Mirkwood needed to be confronted directly, that waiting only allowed it to grow stronger. Saruman found reason after reason to delay. More study was needed. The Council's resources were insufficient for a direct assault. The risk of premature action outweighed the danger of temporary inaction. What the others did not know, what Saruman carefully concealed even from Galadriel's penetrating gaze, was that his opposition to action against Dol Guldur stemmed not from an excess of caution, but from knowledge he had gained through forbidden means and purposes he could not reveal. For Saruman had begun using the Palantir of Orthanc, the seeing stone that had rested in his tower since the days when Gondor's power stretched from the sea to the mountains. Through that stone, he had learned the true identity of the necromancer, that he was indeed Sauron himself, returned to physical form and slowly rebuilding his strength. This knowledge should have spurred Saruman to immediate and decisive action, should have been shared with the Council as the gravest possible news. Instead, he hoarded it, kept it secret, used it to shape the Council's decisions without revealing the basis for his recommendations. Because Saruman had begun to see the returning Dark Lord not merely as an enemy to be destroyed, but as a subject for study. An opportunity to observe the rebuilding of power, to witness firsthand the techniques and methods that Sauron was employing, to gather intelligence that might ultimately prove useful. Useful for what, if pressed? Saruman would have claimed that understanding the enemy was essential to defeating him. But the truth, which he admitted to himself only in the deepest hours of night, was more complex and more troubling. He wanted to understand not merely how to defeat Sauron, but how to replicate what Sauron had achieved. How to wield power on that scale. How to command the obedience of servants and allies. How to shape the fate of Middle-earth according to a unified will and vision. The rivalry with Gandalf had become more than mere jealousy. It had become justification for a path that Saruman knew, in his heart of hearts, was leading him away from his original mission. For if Gandalf and the others were too foolish to understand the necessary measures, if they were too bound by sentiment and outdated principles to do what needed to be done, then perhaps Saruman would have to act alone. Perhaps he would have to find his own way to oppose Sauron, using methods that the others would not approve, but which his superior wisdom told him were necessary. The White Wizard was no longer merely studying evil. He was beginning to believe that wielding it might be justified, that the cause of good might require employing the enemy's own methods. And with that belief, the last barriers against his fall began to crumble. The disease had spread beyond cure. The symptoms were visible to those with eyes to see. But the patient, convinced of his own perfect health, refused all treatment and mocked the physicians who urged him toward healing. Saruman's pride had become a wall that no truth could penetrate, no friendship could scale, no wisdom could overcome. The abyss was opening at his feet, and he walked toward it with absolute confidence, certain that his wisdom would carry him safely across. The stone that sealed Saruman's fate was ancient beyond memory. One of the 7 Palantari, crafted in the Undying Lands by F. Anor himself. F. Anor, the greatest of elven smiths, whose pride and brilliance had kindled the flames that consumed the First Age. These seeing stones had been brought to Middle Earth in the ships of Nant Mena, gifts from the Elder to the kings of men in the days when the D2 Nidane stood tall and proud, and their realm stretched from the shores of the sundering seas to the borders of Mordor itself. 7 stones there were, placed in towers across the kingdoms of Arna and Gondor, allowing the kings to communicate across vast distances and to keep watch over their far-flung dominions. Through the Palantiri, a ruler in Minas Tirith could speak with his representatives in the north, could observe distant borders without traveling, could coordinate the defenses of a realm that spanned half the breadth of Middle Earth. They were tools of governance, of communication, of vigilance, and they were extraordinarily powerful. But the craft that makes a tool effective can also make it dangerous. The Palantari were designed to see truly, to pierce veils and penetrate deceptions, to reveal what was hidden. They showed reality without filter or mercy, and in that absolute clarity lay both their utility and their peril. For truth, when perceived without the context of wisdom, can become a weapon more dangerous than any lie. The stone that rested in Orthanc had been there since the tower's construction, built into its very foundations by the Nentamen. Rians who raised that black pillar of unbreakable stone in the closing years of the Second Age. Through the long centuries of Gondor's glory and decline, through the sundering of the kingdom and the loss of Arna to war and plague, through the slow fading of the D2 Nidane's power and the gradual forgetting of ancient lore, the Palantir had remained in Orthanc, waiting. When the stewards of Gondor granted the tower to Saruman as a dwelling place in recognition of his wisdom and his service as head of the White Council, they did so believing that the seeing stone had long since fallen dormant, that whatever power it once possessed had faded with the passing of the Nentmen, Reen kings. They mentioned its existence to the White Wizard, but placed no particular importance on it, treating it as a curiosity, a relic of bygone days, a historical artifact rather than a functioning tool. They were wrong. For long years after taking up residence in Orthanc, Saruman resisted the temptation to use the Palantir, contenting himself with studying it as he studied all things, cataloguing its properties and capabilities, understanding its function as one node in a network of seeing stones that had once allowed the D2 Nidane to govern their empire. He learned the histories of the Palantiri, traced their lineage back through the ages to their creation in Valinor, mastered the principles by which they operated. But knowledge of a tool's function is not the same as resisting the desire to use it. And as Saruman's isolation within the White Council grew, as his suspicions of Gandalf's secret purposes deepened, and as his research into the lore of the rings revealed ever more disturbing possibilities, the Palantir began to call to him with increasing insistence. What harm could there be in using it to watch and ward, to keep vigil against the enemy's movements? Was it not his duty, as head of the White Council, to gather intelligence by whatever means were at his disposal? If the other members of the council chose to keep secrets from him, If they whispered in corners and made plans without his knowledge, did he not have the right, indeed, the obligation, to discover those secrets through other channels? The rationalizations came easily, as they always do to the brilliant mind bent on justifying what it has already decided to do. Saruman told himself that using the Palantir was merely prudent, that it represented a resource too valuable to ignore, that his wisdom and strength of will was sufficient to protect him from any danger the seeing stone might represent. He was wrong about that too. The first time Saruman looked into the Palantir, he saw only what he expected to see: glimpses of distant lands, movements of armies and navies, the slow dance of politics and power that shaped the fate of Middle-earth. The experience was exhilarating, like having a window that could open onto any place he desired to observe. He could watch Gondor's borders without traveling there, could observe the doings in Lothlorien and Rivendell without attending in person, could peer into the darkening forest of Mirkwood and see with his own eyes what was stirring in the shadow of Dol Guldur. But the seeing, stones had been designed for communication, and communication requires two parties. A Palantir was not a window that only looked one way. It was a connection that could be perceived from both ends. And somewhere in the darkness of Barad-dûr, in the ruins of the Dark Tower that Sauron was slowly rebuilding stone by stone, another seeing stone rested, the Master Stone, the greatest of the seven. The stone that could dominate all others and bend them to serve its holder's purposes. Sauron had recovered that stone from the ruins of Osgiliath when the city fell into chaos, had carried it back to Mordor and placed it at the pinnacle of his tower. Through it, he maintained watch over Middle-earth, searched for the ring that had been lost to him, coordinated the movements of his servants and allies. And when Saruman began using the Palantir of Orthanc, when the stone in Isengard awakened after centuries of dormancy and opened its eye once more upon the world, the Dark Lord felt it immediately. Two stones touching across the void, two minds, meeting in the space between thought and vision where the Palantir re-operated. One will, ancient and terrible and absolutely without mercy. The other will, powerful certainly, wise beyond the measure of mortal kind, but still, in the end, the will of a servant rather than a master, of one sent to guide rather than to rule. The contest was unequal from the beginning. Sauron had spent 3,000 years learning to bend others to his purposes. 3,000 years perfecting the arts of domination and control. 3,000 years studying the weaknesses and fears and desires that made even the strong vulnerable to manipulation. Against such ancient and terrible experience, what could even the wisdom of a Maya avail? Yet Saruman's pride was such that he believed he could match will with will, thought with thought. He imagined himself as a spy in the enemy's camp, gathering crucial intelligence while remaining undetected, secure in his own strength and protected by his superior knowledge. He told himself that he understood the danger, that he was taking appropriate precautions, that his encounters with Sauron through the Palantir were carefully controlled and deliberately limited. He was deceiving himself, and somewhere in the deepest chambers of his consciousness, he knew it. But pride is the most effective of all lies, because it tells us exactly what we wish to hear. That we are the exception. That the rules that govern others need not constrain us, That our wisdom makes us immune to the corruption that has claimed the merely clever. Night after night, Saruman returned to the Palantir. Drawn by an addiction, he no longer had the will to resist. The seeing stone's call became irresistible, pulling at him during councils and studies, invading his dreams with visions of fire and shadow, whispering promises of knowledge and power that lay just beyond his current reach. Each time he looked into its depths, he told himself it would be the last time, that he had gathered the intelligence he needed, that further use was unnecessary. But the stone had already become a chain, and with each use, that chain grew shorter and heavier. The visions it showed him became more specific, more detailed, more compelling. He saw the vast preparations being made in Mordor, the forges being lit and the armies being bred, the intricate web of alliances and coercions that Sauron was weaving across the eastern lands. He saw maps and plans, deployment schedules and supply routes, everything a military strategist could desire. But he also saw other things. Visions of possible futures, of alternative timelines where different choices led to different outcomes. He saw Middle-earth united under a single will, its peoples organized and purposeful, its resources deployed with perfect efficiency. He saw an end to petty conflicts and tribal loyalties, to the chaos and waste that characterized the free people's approach to their own defense. He saw order imposed where disorder had reigned, strength where weakness had festered. And in those visions, gradually, and with such subtlety that he never noticed the transition, he began to see himself, not as Sauron's enemy, but as his partner, not as the destroyer of the Dark Lord's plans, but as their perfecter. For surely, Saruman's wisdom whispered to him, surely Sauron's fundamental error was not in seeking to order Middle-earth, but in the cruel and tyrannical methods he employed. What if the same ends could be achieved through enlightened guidance rather than brutal domination? What if knowledge and wisdom, rather than fear and force, became the tools of unification? This was the poison working its way into Saruman's deepest thoughts. Not the obvious corruption of being directly commanded by evil, but the subtle subversion of having his own purposes bent incrementally toward alignment with the enemy's. Sauron, master of domination, did not need to force Saruman's obedience. He needed only to show the White Wizard a vision of power that appealed to his pride, that made use of his jealousy, that offered fulfillment for his growing resentment of those who questioned his wisdom. The conversations, if they could be called that, between Saruman and Sauron through the Palantir were not dialogues between equals. They were gradual negotiations in which one party held all the leverage and knew it, while the other party believed he was maintaining his independence even as it slipped away. Sauron made suggestions rather than commands, posed questions rather than issuing orders, invited Saruman to draw his own conclusions from carefully curated information. And slowly, so gradually that the White Wizard never noticed the change, the nature of their relationship transformed. Where once Saruman had sought to spy upon Sauron, now he found himself reporting to him, sharing information about the White Council's discussions, revealing Gandalf's movements and concerns, providing intelligence that could only have come from within the highest levels of the free peoples. Leadership. Saruman told himself he was playing a deeper game, that his apparent cooperation with Sauron was actually a masterful deception that would ultimately lead to the Dark Lord's defeat. He convinced himself that by seeming to serve, he was actually positioning himself to strike at the perfect moment, to use his insider knowledge to bring down the entire edifice of Sauron's planning. But the truth was simpler and more terrible. The White Wizard was no longer his own master. The seeing stone that he had thought to use as a tool had become a chain that bound him ever more tightly to his doom. The pride that had made him believe he was wise enough to resist corruption had become the very weakness through which corruption entered. In the darkness of Orthanc, standing before the Palantir with its surface swirling with visions of fire and shadow, Saruman no longer looked like the leader of the White Council, the guardian of Middle-earth, the servant of the Valar, sent to oppose the growing darkness. He looked like what he had become, a puppet, dancing to music only he could hear, convinced of his own autonomy, even as invisible strings jerked his limbs through predetermined motions. The stone glowed. The eye within it grew larger, more insistent. And Saruman, who once commanded the respect of Elrond and Galadriel, who once stood as the chief hope of the free peoples, bowed his head in submission to a will greater and darker than his own. The seeing stone had shown him truth after all. Just not the truth he had expected to find. It had revealed what Saruman truly was beneath all his accumulated wisdom and carefully cultivated authority, a servant like any other, a tool to be used and discarded, a temporary convenience in the great pattern of dominion that Sauron was weaving. The White Wizard had looked into the Palantir seeking knowledge. What he found instead was his master, and he welcomed it, telling himself, even as the chains tightened, that he remained free. The betrayal, when it came at last into the open, was not a single dramatic act, but a cascade of deceptions, each building upon the last until the very foundations of the White Council were undermined and the fellowship that had stood for nearly 2,000 years against the growing shadow finally shattered beyond any hope of repair. It began, as many betrayals do, with small omissions rather than outright lies. Saruman's reports from his studies grew more guarded, his sharing of information more selective. When the council met to discuss the shadow in Dol Guldur, the White Wizard would present his analysis with the same authoritative voice, the same appearance of complete disclosure. But careful listeners began to notice what was not being said, the gaps in his accounting, the questions he deflected rather than answered. Gandalf noticed first, as he noticed so many things that others missed. The Grey Wizard had spent centuries wandering Middle-earth, learning to read the subtleties of speech and silence, the tells that revealed when someone was concealing truth behind technically accurate statements. He began to question Saruman more closely in council meetings, probing at inconsistencies, asking for sources and evidence, requesting details that the White Wizard seemed reluctant to provide. These exchanges grew increasingly tense. Where, once Saruman had welcomed questions as opportunities to display his knowledge, now he treated them as challenges to his authority, as implications that his wisdom was somehow insufficient or his integrity suspect. He would respond with barely concealed irritation, reminding the council that he was its chosen leader, that his research exceeded anyone else's in scope and depth. that if he deemed certain details unnecessary to share, it was because his judgment, honed over centuries of study, had determined they were not relevant to the council's deliberations. Galadriel watched these confrontations with growing concern. She could see the darkness taking root in Saruman's heart, could sense the corruption working its way deeper into his thoughts and purposes. But she was constrained by the very real danger that speaking openly would fracture the council at a time when unity was desperately needed. If she accused Saruman of betrayal without absolute proof, it would create a schism that would destroy the organization's ability to coordinate resistance against Sauron. So she waited and watched and hoped that somehow the White Wizard would turn back from the path he was walking. She attempted, in the subtle ways available to one of her power and perception, to reach through the growing darkness to whatever remained of Saruman's original purpose. But she found her efforts blocked, deflected. Her attempts at communication turned aside by walls of pride and resentment that had become nearly impenetrable. The crisis came to a head around the question of the necromancer. For centuries, Gandalf had been arguing with increasing urgency that the shadow in Dol Guldur needed to be confronted directly, that allowing it to grow stronger was a strategy doomed to catastrophic failure. His journeys into Mirkwood had shown him the extent of the forest's corruption, the way darkness was spreading from that central point of evil, like poison seeping through living tissue. But Saruman consistently opposed action, finding reason after reason to delay. He argued that the council's resources were insufficient for a direct assault, that premature action might drive the necromancer underground where he could not be watched. That patience and further study would reveal weaknesses that could be exploited. His arguments were sophisticated and seemed reasonable, and for many years they carried the day. What the council did not know, what Saruman carefully concealed, was that he already knew the necromancer's true identity. Through the Palantir, he had learned that the shadow in Dol Guldur was Sauron himself, returned to physical form and growing in power with each passing year. This knowledge should have made him the most vocal advocate for immediate action, should have spurred him to sound the alarm and rally the free peoples to strike before the Dark Lord could fully recover his strength. Instead, he used that knowledge to protect Sauron from the Council's interference. Better to let the Dark Lord rebuild undisturbed, Saruman told himself, than to risk his defeat at the hands of others. For if Sauron were destroyed by the White Council, how could Saruman hope to claim the power and knowledge that studying the enemy had led him to desire? The duplicity went deeper still. Through the Palantir, Saruman began providing Sauron with intelligence about the Council's discussions and plans. When Gandalf proposed strategies or revealed information he had gathered, Saruman would share these details with the Dark Lord, allowing him to adjust his own plans accordingly. The head of the White Council, sworn to oppose the growing darkness, had become its informant, actively undermining the organization he was supposed to lead. But it was Gandalf's investigation of the ring, the magic ring found by the creature golem and passed to Bilbo Baggins, that finally brought Saruman's betrayal into the open. The Grey Wizard's research had led him to terrible conclusions about the true nature of Bilbo's treasure. conclusions that made the ring not merely important, but absolutely central to any hope of resisting Sauron's domination. When Gandalf came to Orthanc seeking Saruman's counsel on this matter, when he shared his fears and his discoveries, expecting to find in the head of the White Council an ally who would help him understand the full implications of what he had found, he discovered instead a trap that had been decades in the making. Saruman revealed himself at last. Not all at once, not with the dramatic flourish of one who takes pride in his villainy, but gradually, like the slow exposure of something rotting that had been hidden beneath a beautiful facade. He spoke of the futility of opposing Sauron's inevitable victory, of the necessity of accommodation and pragmatism in the face of overwhelming force. He argued that the wise would seek to preserve what they could through negotiation, rather than invite total destruction through hopeless resistance. The White Wizard's voice, that instrument which had swayed councils and commanded the respect of the wise, worked its arts upon Gandalf, attempting to bend his will, to make the Grey Wizard see reason, or what Saruman called reason, but which was truly despair, dressed in the robes of wisdom. He painted a vision of Middle-earth under ordered dominion, of the chaos of the free peoples replaced by unity of purpose, of strength and efficiency, where now there was only weakness and waste. And beneath these reasonable words, like poisoned bedrock under fertile soil, lay the deeper truth. Saruman no longer sought to prevent Sauron's victory, but to share in it, to claim his portion of the dominion that would inevitably follow. He offered Gandalf a partnership in this new order, a place of honor and authority in the regime that would govern Middle-earth, once the last pathetic resistance of the free peoples had been swept away. Gandalf's refusal was immediate and absolute. There was no hesitation, no moment of temptation, no consideration of Saruman's offer. The Grey Wizard saw with perfect clarity what his former ally had become, and his rejection cut through all of Saruman's sophistries with the clean stroke of absolute moral certainty. "So you are revealed at last, Saruman the White," Gandalf said, and his voice carried a sorrow that went beyond mere disappointment into something approaching grief. For he had lost not merely an ally but a brother, one of the 5 Istari sent together from the Undying Lands to serve the free peoples. You were to be the greatest of our order, the leader in our resistance against evil, and you have chosen instead to serve it. Saruman's response revealed the depths of his fall. He did not argue that Gandalf misunderstood him, did not attempt to explain that his apparent service to Sauron was actually some deeper strategy. Instead, he dropped the pretense entirely and revealed the truth of his transformation. He no longer saw himself as serving anyone. Against the power that has now arisen there is no victory, Saruman declared, and his voice carried absolute conviction. We may join with that power. It would be wise, Gandalf. There is hope that way. Its victory is at hand, and there will be rich reward for those that aided it. But the White Wizard's words betrayed him even as he spoke them. For he did not speak of serving Sauron. He spoke of joining with power, of aiding victory, using language that suggested partnership rather than submission. Even now, even as he acknowledged his allegiance to the Dark Lord, Saruman believed he was maintaining some measure of independence, some degree of autonomy. He thought he was negotiating the terms of Earth's future, when in truth, he had already sold himself entirely. Body and will and purpose. When Gandalf refused to join him in this enterprise, refused to abandon his loyalty to the free peoples for the illusion of safety through collaboration with evil, Saruman's mask fell away completely. The White Wizard revealed the extent of his preparation for this moment, the thoroughness of his betrayal. Gandalf's eagle messenger, Gwyer, was shot down by archers Saruman had positioned specifically for this purpose. The Grey Wizard himself was imprisoned atop Orthanc, held captive by one who had once been his brother in service to the light. From the pinnacle of the Black Tower, with the wind whipping his grey robes, and the valley of Isengard spreading below. A valley that had once been green and beautiful, but was now being transformed into a wasteland of forges and pits. Gandalf stood alone and betrayed. The White Council, for all practical purposes, had ceased to exist in that moment. Its head had revealed himself as a traitor. Its purpose had been compromised from within. Its fellowship had been shattered beyond repair. Yet even in this moment of absolute betrayal, there remained a terrible irony. Saruman truly believed he was acting with wisdom and foresight. Even as he imprisoned Gandalf, even as he revealed his treachery and aligned himself with the enemy, he told himself that his actions were necessary, that his former allies were too foolish to understand the larger game being played, that history would vindicate his choices. The White Wizard had fallen so far into darkness that he could no longer distinguish between wisdom and treachery, between pragmatism and evil, between strength and servitude. He looked at his transformation and saw evolution rather than devolution, growth rather than corruption, the flowering of his full potential rather than its perversion. And in that blindness lay the completion of his tragedy. Not merely that he had fallen, but that he no longer recognized his fall as such. Not merely that he had been corrupted, but that he believed his corruption was enlightenment. Not merely that he served evil, but that he had convinced himself he was serving a higher purpose that transcended the simple morality of good and evil that constrained lesser minds. The last bonds of fellowship that had held the White Council together were severed. The organization that had stood for nearly 2,000 years as the chief coordination body for resistance against Sauron was destroyed from within by its own leader. The betrayal was complete, and somewhere in the darkness of Barad-dûr, Sauron looked through his palantir and smiled, if such a being could be said to smile, at how easily the proud had been brought low, how thoroughly the wise had been made foolish, how completely the guardian had become the betrayer. The white hand of Saruman was raised now not in blessing, but in allegiance to the Dark Lord, and Middle-earth, which had relied on the wisdom and strength of the White Council, would have to find another way to oppose the growing shadow. In the deep histories of Middle-earth, in the vast tapestries of song and story that the elves weave to preserve the memory of ages, there runs a thread of sorrow that connects the greatest falls to the greatest pride. Saruman's betrayal was not unique in the annals of Arda. It was merely the latest iteration of a pattern as old as creation itself, a tragic echo of falls that had come before and shaped the very nature of the world. Before Saruman fell, there was Melka. In the beginning, before time itself, when only the Einar existed in the timeless halls with LOTR the All-Father. Melkor was the mightiest of all the Valar. To him was given the greatest power and the deepest knowledge, understanding of all the themes of creation that LOTR had revealed. He alone among the Valar sought to comprehend not merely one aspect of existence, but the entirety of the music that would bring the world into being. But this greatness became his downfall. For in seeking to understand all themes, Melkor began to desire to create his own, to add to the music not harmony, but variations of his own devising, thoughts and purposes that came from himself rather than from LOTR. At first, these variations seemed beautiful, for Melkor's power was vast and his creativity profound. But gradually, his improvisations began to conflict with the great theme, to create discord rather than enrichment. Pride told Melkor that his additions improved upon the original design, that his wisdom allowed him to see possibilities that even LOTR had not conceived. He could not bear the thought that he was merely an interpreter of another's vision, rather than a creator in his own right. And so he fell into opposition, attempting to drown out the music of the Aenir with a cacophony of his own making. The parallel to Saruman is exact and terrible. Both were given gifts surpassing their peers. Melkor in power, Saruman in wisdom. Both came to believe that their gifts made them exceptions to the rules that governed others. Both thought they could improve upon the purposes for which they were created. Both fell through the conviction that service was beneath their dignity, that they were meant for mastery rather than stewardship. And there were others who walked this path between Melkor's fall and Saruman's. Anor, greatest of all the elven smiths, whose skill was so profound that he captured the light of the two trees themselves in the Silmarils, those gems of surpassing beauty that became the cause of wars lasting centuries. His craftsmanship was unmatched, his brilliance undeniable, his pride absolute. When Morgoth, Melkor in his fully fallen state, stole the Silmarils and fled into Middle-earth, Anor's response revealed the corruption that pride had worked in his heart. He swore a terrible oath, binding himself and his sons to pursue the thief unto the ends of the earth, to wage war against anyone, Valar, elf, or man, who stood between them and the recovery of his treasures. Notice the possessiveness, the sense of ownership that drove Anor. The Silmarils were his creation, the work of his hands, and he could not bear the thought of them in another's possession. His love of beauty had curdled into jealous ownership, his pride in his craft into an obsession that would ultimately destroy not merely himself, but thousands who had the misfortune to be caught in the wake of his wrath. Here too we see Saruman reflected. The White Wizard's knowledge, his accumulated lore, his understanding of the enemy's methods. These became possessions he hoarded rather than gifts he shared. His studies transformed from a means of serving the free peoples into ends in themselves, sources of pride rather than tools of liberation. And when he felt that pride threatened, when Gandalf's growing influence seemed to diminish his own authority, Saruman's response mirrored Anor's jealous rage, though expressed through more subtle means. Even in the Second Age, the pattern repeated. The Nentermen Reans, blessed beyond all other mortal men, with long life and great wisdom, with strength and beauty, and the friendship of the elves. gradually fell into shadow through the same sequence. Gifts leading to pride, pride leading to resentment of limitations, resentment leading to the desire to transcend the bounds set by the Valar. They looked westward toward the undying lands and grew jealous of the immortality granted to the elves. They listened to Sauron's counsel, for the Dark Lord served a time as advisor to their kings, just as Saruman would later advise the free peoples while secretly serving their enemy, and became convinced that the Valar's prohibition against sailing to Valinor was not wisdom, but tyranny, not protection but oppression. In the end, the greatest fleet Nen Menna had ever assembled set sail westward, intending to claim by force what had been denied them by law. The result was catastrophe beyond measure. The drowning of Nent Menna beneath the waves, the transformation of the world from flat to round, the removal of the undying lands from the physical world entirely. Uncounted thousands died because pride had convinced them they deserved what they had not been given. What connects all these falls, from Melkor to Efdanor to Nentermenna to Saruman, is the fundamental error of believing that wisdom, power, or virtue creates a right to transcend the moral law that governs lesser beings. Each began from a place of genuine excellence. Each possessed gifts that set them apart and above their peers. Each used those gifts initially in service of good purposes, but excellence, untempered by humility, becomes the gateway to corruption. For when you are accustomed to being right more often than others, you begin to assume you are right always. When your wisdom exceeds that of your peers, you begin to believe their counsel is unnecessary or even obstructive. When your understanding of complex matters surpasses what others can grasp, you begin to think that you alone can judge what actions are necessary. Tolkien understood this pattern deeply, wove it through his entire mythology as a warning and a mirror. For he had witnessed in his own lifetime the catastrophic consequences of brilliant minds, convinced of their own righteousness. He had seen the intellectual elite of Europe lead their nations into the mechanized slaughter of the Great War, had watched as ideologies, promising rational reorganization of society, produced instead totalitarian nightmares. The corrupted wisdom of Saruman reflected the corrupted wisdom of the 20th century's failed utopianists. Those who believed that enough knowledge, enough planning, enough control could perfect humanity and create paradise on earth. Like Saruman, they began with noble intentions. Like Saruman, they accumulated genuine insights into how societies function and how systems operate. And like Saruman, they convinced themselves that the rules constraining others need not apply to them, that suffering could be justified if it served the greater good, that the end would sanctify whatever means proved necessary. Saruman's fall was not unique in its nature, but it was perhaps unique in its completeness. For he was not merely a lord who sought to expand his domain, not merely a craftsman who became too proud of his work, not merely a king who desired immortality. He was a Maya, one of the powers of the world, sent from the undying lands, specifically to guard against the very corruption that ultimately claimed him. His betrayal was not just of his allies in the White Council, not merely of the free peoples who had trusted him, but of his own nature, his own purpose, the very reason for his existence in Middle-earth. The Valar had sent him to inspire resistance to Sauron, and he became Sauron's servant. He was meant to kindle hope, and he spread despair. He was sent to guide the free peoples toward the light, and he led them into shadow. The white robes that had once marked him as the leader of the Istari, the symbol of purity and commitment to the cause of good, were transformed into a coat of many colors, shifting, unstable, beautiful in a superficial way, but fundamentally dishonest. The many colors represented not the richness of wisdom, but the refusal to commit to any single purpose, the attempt to serve multiple masters, the fundamental duplicity of one who claimed to pursue good while actually serving evil. But in the end, all colors fade to black when touched by shadow, and Saruman, who had begun as the brightest of the Istari, became indistinguishable from the darkness he was meant to oppose. The hand that had been raised in blessing became a fist closed in wrath and grasping. The voice that had once spoken words of wisdom and comfort became an instrument of lies and manipulation. Standing in the ruins of Isengard, after Saruman's defeat, after the Ents had torn down his walls and broken his machines, after the White Wizard had been cast down from his tower and stripped of his power, one could still see traces of what he had once been. The Tower of Orthing remained unbroken, black and gleaming, a testament to the skill and power that had once been devoted to the service of light. But now it stood empty and silent, its master fallen from grace, beyond any hope of redemption, a monument to the terrible truth that even the wisest can fall. Even the strongest can be broken. Even the most devoted servants of good can become champions of evil. And in that ruin lies, perhaps the most important lesson of all, that greatness is not a guarantee of righteousness, that wisdom is not the same as goodness, that knowledge untempered by humility becomes not enlightenment, but the most dangerous form of blindness. For those who believe themselves too wise to fall are already falling. As we stand now in the shadow of this tale, as we contemplate the wreckage of what was once the greatest of the Istari, we are left with questions that echo far beyond the borders of Middle Earth and touch upon fundamental truths about wisdom, pride, and the eternal struggle between service and mastery that defines so much of existence. If Saruman could fall, Saruman the Wise, Saruman the White, chosen leader of the White Council and guardian of the free peoples, then what hope have any of us against the corruptions that lurk within our own hearts? If knowledge itself can become a poison when divorced from humility, if wisdom can transform into folly through the alchemy of pride, if the very virtues we prize most highly can become the instruments of our destruction, then how are we to guard against such darkness? The answer lies not in the tragedy of Saruman's fall, but in the quiet heroism of those who stood against him. For even as the White Wizard descended into shadow, others demonstrated that different choices were possible. That excellence need not lead to corruption. That greatness could be wedded to humility in ways that produced light rather than darkness. Gandalf the Grey chose humility over pride at every turning. Where Saruman accumulated knowledge as a miser hoards gold, Gandalf shared wisdom freely with all who sought it. Where Saruman built his power base through demonstrations of mastery and assertions of authority, Gandalf earned trust through genuine care for those he served. Where Saruman isolated himself in his tower, surrounded by books and artifacts, Gandalf walked the roads of Middle-earth, breaking bread with hobbits and rangers, attending to the small joys and common sorrows of simple folk. And in the end, when the crisis came and the fate of Middle-earth hung in the balance, it was Gandalf's choice of humility over pride that made the crucial difference. He was willing to be imprisoned, willing to suffer, willing even to die in the depths of Moria facing the Balrog, because he had never lost sight of the purpose for which he came to Middle-earth: to serve, not to rule, to inspire, not to control, to kindle hope in the hearts of the free peoples, rather than to command their obedience. The hobbits too demonstrated that heroism takes forms that pride cannot recognize or value. Frodo bearing the ring to Mount Doom, Sam refusing to abandon his master, even in the darkest moments. Merry and Pippin finding courage they did not know they possessed. These acts of simple loyalty and stubborn persistence proved stronger than all of Saruman's accumulated wisdom and carefully crafted strategies. Saruman would have dismissed the hobbits as beneath his notice, too small and simple to matter in the great game of power. Yet it was precisely their smallness, their ordinariness, their lack of pretension to wisdom or strength that made them capable of bearing burdens that would have crushed the proud. They had no reputation to protect, no image of themselves as great and wise to maintain. They could admit fear without shame, could ask for help without embarrassment, could fail and rise again without the paralyzing weight of wounded pride. Even the Ents, ancient guardians of the forest, demonstrated in their march on Isengard that patience need not mean passivity, that care for living things creates strength rather than weakness. Treebeard and his people had watched Saruman's corruption for years, had seen the forests around Isengard felled and fed to the furnaces, had witnessed the transformation of a green valley into a wasteland of industry and exploitation. They rose at last not in rage but in measured wrath, the considered judgment of beings who understood deeply what was being destroyed and chose to defend it. Their assault on Isengard, tearing down walls and damming rivers, breaking machines and casting down towers, was not an explosion of mindless fury, but a deliberate act of resistance by those who loved what the White Wizard had chosen to destroy. Tolkien's great gift to us was not the creation of a world where evil is always defeated by good through superior strength or wisdom, where the wise always triumph over the foolish, where power is always wielded with justice and mercy. Instead, he gave us a world that mirrors our own. A world where good and evil are often intertwined, where the greatest heroes are often those who seem least likely to succeed, where victory comes not through strength or wisdom or knowledge, but through the simple decision to do what is right regardless of the cost. The ruins of Isengard still stand in our imagination as a reminder of what can happen when virtue becomes vice, when service transforms into domination, when the desire to do good curdles into the willingness to do evil for what we tell ourselves are good purposes. But alongside those ruins stand other monuments, the Shire rebuilt and flourishing, Gondor restored to its former glory, the forests green and growing once more under the care of those who love rather than exploit them. And in that contrast lies perhaps the most important lesson of all darkness, however powerful, however ancient, however wise in its own corruption, cannot ultimately triumph over the light that lives in simple hearts and speaks through humble voices, not because the humble are stronger, they manifestly are not. Not because the simple are wiser, they would never claim to be, but because humility carries within it a protection against the corruptions that destroy the proud. For the humble can admit error and change course. The simple can ask for help without shame. Those who do not think themselves wise can learn from their mistakes instead of rationalizing them. Those who do not consider themselves powerful cannot be corrupted by the exercise of power. Those who serve rather than seeking to rule cannot be tempted by the promises of dominion. Saruman's staff was broken at last on the steps of Orthanc, broken by Gandalf, who had returned from death itself with authority that the White Wizard no longer possessed. His voice, that instrument which had swayed councils and commanded armies, was stilled. His power was scattered to the winds. The white hand that had been raised in allegiance to the Dark Lord hung limp and powerless. But the White Council, though forever changed by his betrayal, fulfilled its purpose in the end. The shadow was lifted, Sauron's power broken, the free peoples preserved in their freedom, not because the wise proved wiser than their folly. Saruman had been counted among the wisest, and he fell completely. Not because the strong proved stronger than their weakness. The mightiest of the Istari became a servant of the enemy. But because in the end, there were those willing to walk in humility and serve something greater than themselves. And so the story ends as it began, with a question that haunts us still. If wisdom itself can fall to pride, if knowledge can become a poison, if the very gifts that should protect us can become our downfall, what hope have we? But now we know the answer, written in starlight across the dome of night, whispered in the wind that stirs the leaves, sung in the voices of those who remember that even the smallest person can change the course of the future. Our hope lies not in avoiding the possibility of darkness, but in choosing the light when darkness calls. Not in never falling, for all fall at times, but in rising each time we stumble. Not in being wise enough to resist all temptation, but in being humble enough to recognize when we have been tempted and to seek help in resisting. The path Saruman walked is still open, still whispers its promises to those who believe themselves wise enough to walk it without falling. It offers knowledge without humility, power without accountability, the freedom to pursue our purposes without the constraints of conscience or the inconvenience of service to others. It tells us we are the exception, that the rules governing lesser beings need not constrain us, that our wisdom makes us immune to the corruptions that have claimed the merely clever. And it lies. It always lies. Just as it lied to Melkor and Anor, and the kings of Nanmena and Saruman himself. The path that promises enlightenment leads to darkness. The road that offers freedom ends in chains. The voice that claims to speak wisdom whispers despair. But there is another path, walked by Gandalf and Frodo, by Sam and the Ents, by all those who chose service over mastery and humility over pride. It is not an easier path. Often it is harder, for it requires setting aside our pretensions and admitting our limitations. It offers no promises of power or dominion, no assurances that we will be recognized as wise or great. It demands that we serve purposes larger than ourselves, that we value truth more than reputation, that we love what is good, even when loving it costs us dearly. But it is the path that leads to life, to genuine wisdom, rather than the counterfeit that pride produces. To real strength, rather than the weakness that masquerades as power. To freedom earned through service, rather than the slavery that calls itself mastery. The white hand of Saruman is closed forever, its power broken, its bearer fallen beyond redemption. But other hands remain open, ready to help, ready to serve, ready to hold fast to what is good and true and beautiful in this world, no matter what darkness may come. The choice is before us, as it has always been, as it was before Saruman in the Tower of Orthanc. Will we choose wisdom tempered by humility, or knowledge corrupted by pride? Will we serve the light, or grasp at shadows? Will we walk the hard road that leads to life, or the broad path that ends in darkness? Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.